Today, if I walk down the street in Portland, Oregon, what I see is this picture that you see on the bottom of the page. In 1920, if a person had walked down the street, what they would have seen was that image at the top of the page. So that rise in poverty and lack of resources and access to the benefits of the country that we live in were as pronounced 100 years ago as they are now. A surge of homelessness and poverty plagued the nation. And this is the world that Gen Z knows and inhabits. Understanding how that affects their worldview is critical to understanding why they behave as they do. And the reason I focus on this is because this is going to impact how they manage and how they behave at work, because the values they develop are not going to be isolated outside of work. Other things that were similar, we had the COVID and social isolation in 2020. Previous generations had the flu epidemic in 1918 through the early 1920s. So there was a global pandemic that impacted how people saw the world. Then and now, young people have seen their parents laid off, the economy disrupted, the government fractured. The Great Depression came at the end of the 1920s. The environment is now at risk for the younger generation, and anxiety and depression is at an all-time high. One of the things that we often do, those of us in older generations, is dismiss the validity of that anxiety, that depression, with things like, well, you know, things were tough for us too, but we got through it, and we don't know why these kids should have so much trouble. We worried about nuclear war, we certainly did, but we didn't worry about the entire world ceasing to exist as a result of climate change. And that is a real fear for younger generations. So here's some facts about this generation that is moving into the workplace and moving into management. First of all, they're more likely to have a college-educated parent than anyone in a previous generation. And they're also more likely to have be enrolled in college or have a college degree themselves. They are, at this point, going to be one of the highest educated, or the highest educated generation in history. They're less likely to be working now than previous generations at their age, partly because they're focused on school more than previous generations, and partly because of complex social issues where the culture of work is not amenable to the aspirations of Gen Z. That's not the same as saying people just don't want to work these days. That's saying younger people have different drivers for what makes them want to be in the workplace, and they have more demands about what they need to see in the workplace. Very few want to work for a substandard wage that doesn't allow them to pay for basic necessities, whereas previous generations didn't face that same kind of challenge. They're slightly less likely to be immigrants than millennials were, but they're more likely to be the children of immigrations, to be second generation. So we are seeing the increasing diversity among this generation, and that is also a very influential factor for this generation in the workplace. 1 in 4 members of Gen Z are Hispanic. The most common surname in the United States today is still Smith, followed by Rodriguez and Gonzalez. So we see that demographic shift playing out every day as we go about our normal activities. And the views of Gen Z mirror millennials in a lot of ways. And they have a different outlook. For example, Gen Z and millennials are more likely than older generations to want an activist government, to want a government that's going to do something to solve some of the social problems, some of the environmental problems, some of the economic problems, the infrastructure problems, and other kinds of challenges that we're facing today. For those of you who are, probably no one in this audience is close to my age, but if you were, you would remember the president in the past who took the greatest, made the greatest steps in addressing those kinds of problems for our nation was FDR. We've systematically, over the last few decades, dismantled the programs that FDR put into place that established the middle class, that provided social safety nets, that allowed for the resolution of a lot of the problems that plagued the country at that point in history. And what we see is a generation that mirrors, again, that greatest generation who wanted an activist government and believed that that's what we needed in order to solve some of the problems that our population faced. And then, of course, there is the issue of climate change, and the younger generations, Gen Z, is very concerned about the impact of that on society, and it impacts many of their behaviors. The young manager whose picture I showed you has eliminated all the environmentally unsound products in her business, and has instituted policies that will help minimize carbon footprint of the business that she is responsible for management. And we see different issues about how people view race in the country. We're looking at Republicans here because it tends to be a more conservative element of our political spectrum. But younger people who identify as Republican are far more likely than older people to believe that there is disparity in how people are treated. Some of that comes absolutely from being part of a diverse environment, a diverse nation, but that is going to play out in workplace policies and in how people relate to each other and how people work together within organizations in the future. It's going to be a very different kind of world. About half of Gen Z and millennials think that same-sex marriage is good for society. And I don't know, I guess I don't know why it's good for society, but the thing that does strike me about this is that for this generation, gender identity doesn't make a difference. It simply is part of a reality, and it doesn't influence how people relate to each other in the ways that it did decades ago for Gen X and for baby boomers. And it's going to make a difference again in the workplace and how people manage, how people relate, and how people provide support for the employees that they are responsible to manage. So, of course, they're more likely to know someone who uses gender neutral pronouns, and to know people who do not consider themselves binary. And that's a huge change from the way the world was when older managers who are in the workplace today were more numerous. One of the things that we need to keep in mind too is when we look at the fact that 20% of the workforce is still boomers, a lot of that 20% are still managers. They've been there a long time. Age, experience has moved them into management and has kept them in management for all of those years, and there is bound to be conflict. They are bound to see Gen Z as being difficult because this is a generation that thinks very differently.